each of these works poses an ending of sorts. And the question with Ling Ma's novel Severance is, if you promise the reader an end of the world, how do you deliver that end? Candace is recalling these things from some future point as she's trying to put together that moment where the beginning of the end begins. As she travels through New York one day, she has this moment of revelation. She says, "The sky looked different, some kind of yellow I'd never seen before, like a bruise trying to heal. Later, trying to pinpoint the beginning of the capital E end, I think about the way the sky looked that day." So the end, is it something that we always try to put back in time to try to locate or pinpoint, as she says? And what resources do we have to try to sort out beginnings from endings? I wanted to kind of pose some layers of ending that are present in Severance in this presentation. There are a number of endings in the novel. The first is kind of the apocalyptic plague, Shen fever, and to kind of rethink it in ways in which it is an ending. You can think about the disease as it progresses, right? And it's a nightmare progression throughout the world, and the human community disappears as it spreads in this globalized world. But you can also think about how Shen fever itself, in its narration, reflects the isolation and compulsions of contemporary life. On page 156, there's the moment where Candace's friend's neighbor is recognized as being fevered, and she's sitting on the couch watching the TV, flipping channels, and as she flips through them, she's laughing, and that's when they call the ambulance, and it becomes clear that she is fevered. So you can think about the instances in the novel where the fever reflects some aspect of contemporary life, of the compulsions of contemporary life, and how those things drive us, and how they drive us into isolation in some ways. That's close to the look on Bob's face at the end of the novel, where Candace sees him walking through the mall, his eyes fixed to a vague middle distance, as if he is watching a secret movie, and that is the gaze of the fevered. And you can imagine, Ling Ma walking through the city, looking at people as they're engrossed with, whatever's on the screen in front of them, and how that also kind of reflects a sense of the gaze of the fevered. In what ways are we focused, refocused, and compelled by those images and short bits of text in front of us on screens? And how does that kind of reflect Shen fever and the way that it distances people in the novel? Another end is the city's disintegration as New York comes apart around Candace. Those stories are replete of how she sees the city coming apart, that she sees it on page 252. It was not just the emptiness of the city, but vegetation was already taking over, as she talks about the trees of heaven beginning to grow up wherever they could in the city, that they weren't being trimmed back by the maintenance crews. There's the moment where she is isolated in the elevator as it stops for a few moments, and she calls for help, and eventually she calls for maintenance of the elevator, and the city promises that it can't get to it immediately, but she has a moment where she's terrified that she's going to be stuck in that elevator until she dies. There's also, as she describes it, the haunted look of these places as she shoots them for New York Ghost, the website, with her photographs, and also the Sentinel logo. It's a private security company that has come into the city and to monitor places in their owner's absence. And so you have this moment where everything, people still believe that things can get quote unquote back to normal, right? And so it's just a matter of getting through the present moment. So there's an optimism there that's false, that works behind the hauntedness of the place. And she, in true kind of Book of Revelation like image, one of the carriage horses appears, is moving through the city, and she sees that as kind of an apocalyptic vision, right, of one of the horsemen from Revelation moving through the city in a way to mark that apocalyptic moment in the city's disintegration. Displacement is also, a common experience for many of us in the world today, and it also is reflected in this novel as a particular end. As Candace's boss, Michael, talks to her about staying on at Spectra, he, says, "This is the world we live in now," as he encourages her to stay and work with the company, despite her doubts about her willingness to stay on there. He's trying to encourage her that no, this is the world as it is now. There is no different world. That you're going to feel this sense of displacement, this sense of not belonging, and yet that's the way it is right now. Yet she has a clear moment, right, on 277 where she remembers that I needed to leave New York, and so she heads for the Lincoln Tunnel. She takes the cab away from Eddie and drives off. So there's the sense of immediate flight that grips her, and will grip her again in the Illinois Mall later in the narration. And there's also a sense of displacement that she feels as she begins to realize Bob's purpose, and the horror she feels in Bob's prayer, and the horror you might feel as a reader of this prayer. To that end, Bob prays, "Please help us keep this child safe. Please help us lead this woman back from her deviated course and set her right." The sense that she feels cut off from this group that she's joined up with, and that she needs to move on. That drives her away from them. Globalized commerce also exists as a kind of end in this book as well, as you see various scenes of trade and its consequences in the world, and the globalized world into which Shin fever spreads rapidly because of connection globally. She feels a frustration, in thinking about the mall as as an ending place, where she says, you go into the same stores looking at the same merchandise, right? This frustration with the commercial world as it exists for her. There's a moment where in New York where as she looks through the items in a looted store, she looks at their labels and sees the various places throughout the world where they've been made as kind of knockoffs in a way. She looks at the labels, she says, made in China, of course it was. You can't escape the realities of this world, right? That world that Michael promises her, right? That world of displacement is also a world of economic exploitation, and that Candace feels that in what she does with her work, and also in the her family situation as well. And this is kind of comedically depicted in the video of the Juicy Couture sales associate, the woman who's fevered, going through the act of folding clothing, and Candace shoots that as a video as the woman who is missing half her jaw continues to fold the clothes and do it in a clear and very ordered way while she is fevered. It's the habit that she feels is the commercial habit. Jonathan's departure from Candace can also be read as an end in this novel. As Matilda, the hurricane, approaches, Jonathan leans away from me, she says, defiant. Neither of us has a family to support, he says. I ate my rice, focused on chewing each and every grain. I wasn't going to tell him. So in this moment, right, she pulls away from him as well. She has to survive that Jonathan's departure, Jonathan deciding to go off towards the Pacific Northwest and to leave her behind, whether it's done out of fear, whether it's done out of sheer selfishness. She feels that as a distinct personal end in the novel as well. You can think about the geographies here as endings as well, right? That Bob leads the group towards this Illinois Mall outside Chicago. And you can think about that as a distinct destination or end in itself. It operates against the image of Utah as Candace's parents imagine it as a kind of promised land, right? The land of overflowing supermarkets and economic opportunity that they experience when they come from China. The mall, though, as an end, never quite offers what it promises, or it delivers what it promises, right? That even though they get to the facility, to this mall, Bob continually mutters to himself as he walks through the mall, "We need more inventory." The facility comes to be seen by Candace as a manifestation of Bob's shoddy ideology that they can just accumulate enough to keep them alive and happy, despite the world coming apart around them. And then there's the literary end of Severance. And does it reach a point of resolution in your reading? There are moments of beginning throughout the novel, right? You can read those, particularly that moment where, Candace begins to kind of come to terms with her pregnancy. As she says on page 226, "With New York wiped out, it is indeed a miracle I am still here. I've begun to think of the baby as a girl. I call her Luna." There's a moment of beginning or initiation in that point, right, where the character is changing and is kind of setting course from there. How do you feel about the novel's conclusion, though, right, the ending, which goes on page 291, "Silence, the engine is dead as she approaches Chicago. Beyond the bridge is more skyline, more city. I get out and start walking." How do you read that as, quote unquote, the end here? So we read for the levels of narrative as you think about the endings in this novel, and a few questions to think through as you puzzle this ending. Again, that central question, of course, what's it like to read a novel about the end of the world while the world is ending around one? And you can think about narratives of the coronavirus here, as they play themselves out at the present against, Ling Ma's Shen fever in Severance. How do you read between those two events? One fictional, one not so fictional. Does the novel ever reach the end? How do you feel about that point of resolution, which is the character continuing to walk into an empty city? Does the novel change your sense of an apocalyptic impulse in literature? So novels about the end of the world, are they spaces in which you can recover meaning or hope here? And how is that impacted by your sense of the novel's comic layers here in particular? So if you might want to note a moment of comedy and think about how it offers meaning or hope. And then finally, as you read for the layers of endings in all of the novels and works throughout the course, how does the end establish itself as a narrative versus a rhetorical act, right? Is the end of an argument that the writer's making in the text, or is the end merely an abstract kind of point, an arbitrary point that the writer works towards, that the writer promises the reader, and does it offer resolution in the end?